Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. The Postmodern Iconoclast is a podcast where we break down false idols and icons of the postmodern digital age in search of more authentic esoteric spirituality. And in this episode, I am going to be doing another story time. I did my first story time like a month and a half ago, I think, where I talked about when I went to Egypt with a bunch of occultists, which was really, really cool. But in this story time, I'm going to be talking about something that has been long requested for me to discuss, and that would be the story of my esoteric path, why I got into occultism, and what led me here. I've mentioned this. Occasionally, I'll talk a little bit about it, but I've never gone into depth because my actual reason for getting into the occult comes from a place of tragedy, really. And so I've kind of avoided talking about it because it starts pretty heavy. But the thing is, I feel like I've been around long enough where I feel comfortable sharing this story. So just be aware I will be opening up a bit about some of the hardships I have experienced and discussing how occultism is what actually pulled me out of some of the hardest times of my life. So, nice light listening for your morning. But on the bright side, it does get out of that dark spot pretty quickly because the occult was something that was really great for my life. Now, before I actually start telling the story, I would like to mention I'm hosting a group trip to Greece with Trova Trip, where a group of my subscribers will come with me to Greece. So definitely sign up for that. The information will be in the show notes or the YouTube description. All right, let's get into the story. So I feel like I should give some general background on like what I grew up around. I feel very much like I'm in a psychological chair and Freud is asking me, tell me about your childhood. Okay, that was the worst accent ever, but you get what I mean. But I feel like that is relevant because someone's religious background is going to color their occult experiences radically. Like I feel that my experiences are always going to be different than someone who say had a Muslim background. So yeah, let's start with my childhood. So I'm originally from Appalachia. That's where I grew up. I grew up in a town in the Appalachian Mountains, in like the South, and I had a pretty. I would describe my family as somewhat like granola or a little outdoorsy type people. Like we went biking a lot, we went hiking a lot. We really spent a lot of time in the mountains. I did later move away and then move back to the mountains, but that's where I grew up. Um, and basically, religiously, it was vaguely religious, but not super serious about it. Like I would still consider my parents to be Christians, but they were not like Bible thumping, "will burn you if you're a witch" type Christians, right? They were a lot more loose about it. So I was baptized in the Episcopal Church, which is the American equivalent to the Church of England. And I grew up around Episcopals until my parents divorced. My parents divorced when I was a kid, and my dad would go on to remarry a woman from a Mormon family. And she herself was pretty non-observant. Like I don't even know if she would self-identify as a Mormon. I have always had a theory she was not religious herself, but just kind of vaguely believed in God. Like she would go to church and say like she likes the message. So I don't consider her particularly religious, but her entire family, right, which is the family my dad married into, and so people I did spend a lot of time around, were Mormons, and some of them were quite serious about it. Like the other cousin, my step cousins, I guess would be the real term, or basically like some of them actually went on mission, and I've they would get married in the temple in DC. And since I was never a Mormon myself, like I had to stand outside the temple while they got married. I went to the Mormon church a few times growing up, but I never actually joined. I was never a Mormon myself, but I was exposed to that. So I was opposed to Episcopalianism, which is a very loose, I think diet Catholicism is a good term for it, type of Christianity, and then Mormonism, which is, of course, a lot more serious. I thought the Mormons were weird. This was my perception, but I always thought they were very friendly. But I never actually joined the Mormon church. Later on, my brother would go on to really explore Mormonism. And so even though my dad did actually end up divorcing my stepmother, there are still kind of people in my family who are kind of Mormon adjacent, I guess would be the term. But yeah, I never really had an LDS upbringing. Like I know I've mentioned that I have Mormons in my family, and some people think I'm like a former LDS or like ex-LDS, and no, that's not what happened. I just had that like in my family, and so it was something that I was exposed to. Like I knew about like Joseph Smith and Utah and all of that. And then, of course, Episcopalianism is kind of standard, like mainline Protestant Christianity. Now, as a kid, I did not have faith really. Like, I never had that like childlike faith that a lot of Christians talk about, where they just naturally believe in Jesus and God. Like, that didn't really come to me. I wouldn't have ever considered myself an atheist. Like, as a kid, I remember when I would take like exams in like elementary school, like we had these like benchmark exams. And I would pray when I submitted my exam that whatever is out there would get me a good grade. Like, whenever I would pray seriously, like if I was sick or something, or I wanted a snow day to get school off, I would like vaguely pray to whoever is out there. Like, I thought someone was out there. I thought there was a God out there, but I wasn't sure what. And as I got a little bit into like tween years, I started actually reading the Bible at church. So in church, they would have, because the church I actually went to was the Episcopal Church. I went to the Mormon church sometimes, but mostly to the Episcopal Church. And when I was at Episcopal Church, like they would have the Bible in the pews, and I would, look through it, read through it. And I started noticing things that I disagreed with, problems. I would just basically like obsessively read the Bible when they were at service and after church. Like, we would go to youth group, right? And so whenever I was in youth group, which happened after like every church service, right, for a couple hours, and we went to church every Sunday, and then youth group every, like after that time, every Sunday. And I would ask a lot of questions. Like, we had like a youth pastor, I guess that would be the term, who I would probably annoy the crap out of, honestly, in retrospect. Like, I would read parts of the Bible and I'd be like, this doesn't make sense to me, or this doesn't align with what I think would be moral, right? I was really asking a lot of hard questions. I mean, some of them they had trouble answering, and some, like, there's been 8 million apologetics essays about. But I saw things that bothered me, right? There were things in the Bible I didn't agree with. I really honestly would say that I kind of adopted like a Gnostic stance. Like, I really was particularly bothered by the Noah's Ark story, right? I thought that that was cruel and unjust. I was bothered by, like, I felt that if God pre-planned everything, like, why were people sinning? Which is, of course, there's a lot of Christian responses to that query. But as a kid, it bothered me. And the youth pastor, I really don't think was equipped to handle apologetics. He didn't really know how to respond to me. And I also, I had some issues with the Lucifer story. I didn't like that. So you guys all know the Lucifer story, right? I thought that, like, there were some actual good grievances with God, like randomly making them obey humans. I was like, oh, because they just got together and they were mad about something their boss, who's God, made them do, right? This was also one of my grievances. I thought that, like, I'd be mad too, right? I didn't think it was cool that God, like, changed the conditions up on the angels. Now, those are my child critiques of Christianity. As an adult, I have very different critiques of Christianity. Like, I have a much more nuanced understanding of the stories. I've heard the apologetics, and I have some actual much more compelling arguments against Christianity. And I think, like, there are much better critiques than what I was coming up with at like age 11. But, what I'm saying is I was like kind of precocious and asked a lot of questions. And just always had concerns about things. I also really liked mythology. I read a lot of mythology. I was a really nerdy kid in general. Like, I guess bookish would be the term, because I guess now people talk about nerdy, they think like pop culture nerds, right? And that's never what I've been or really was. I was bookish, I guess would be the right term. Like, I read a lot. I was definitely really into school. Like, I studied a lot. Like, I was very intellectually oriented. And for me, I read a lot of myths. I read a lot of stories from religions around the world. And so even from a young age, I think I was probably going to go down the path of occultism. Like, there were a lot of like early signs that I could see and go, okay, yeah. And actually, the first real interaction with occultism I ever had was we were on vacation. I don't remember where we were on vacation to, but I think it was like an amusement park, maybe, or we were at a fair. I don't know. Basically, this woman who was like a tarot reading psychic, my mom went to it and took me with her. And of course, I wanted a reading. And I remember thinking the whole thing was super, super cool. And so when I was like 13 and we were at the beach, there was this store at the beach we were at, like this, like, I don't know, is in like a village of the beach. I'm not, once again, these are like early memories. So wherever it was, like I bought a deck of tarot cards at like this. It was like a gift type store, like a knickknack store. Do you know what I'm talking about? Not like a beach knickknack store, but just a general knickknack store that was like located on the main street of the beach town. And I bought a tarot deck and I hid it. I was very secretive about this. Also, as a little kid, I would mix like potions in my bath, where I would like take shampoos and conditioners and like steal my dad's shaving cream and like mix it all in like my bathtub and be like, I'm making a potion. So yeah, there also was a thing I did when I was a kid where I actually tried to curse someone. So there was this girl. I'm gonna call her Megan. This was in. I remember when this was. This was in fourth grade, and she was bullying one of my friends. Because once again, I was kind of like a nerdier kid. Honestly, like I was not in the popular clique. You know what I mean? Like that was just not my vibe. And basically one of my friends was getting bullied and I hated Megan. I thought she was mean and just this mean popular girl. Like I just didn't like her. I resented her. And I decided to try to curse her. Now, I did not know how cursing works. I did not know how magic works. I just had watched, like, my dad loves horror movies. My dad loves true crime. So I had seen that type of stuff on the TV. Like, you know, when you're like supposed to go to bed, but you like kind of sneak and like watch a little bit of the movie you're not allowed to watch. Yeah, that type of stuff. So I actually took a Bible and I picked a random verse and read it backwards. Yes, I'm serious. While mixing like random crap in my bathtub. Once again, I don't know what's with me and like mixing things in my bathtub as a child. I guess I just thought that's how witchcraft worked. And I did try to curse her. Nothing really came of this, but that there was an attempt there. So there were indications. As well, we had this book in the house called The Secret Language of Birthdays. I actually still have a copy of, like, I still have the one from my childhood. Like, I have this book. And it's this like astrology book that has a page for each day of the year, and it's super simplistic. It's like modern astrology. I wouldn't even like recommend buying this book. Like it's mid. I mean, it's a beautiful coffee table type book, like, and it's fun. Like it's one page for the birthday, but obviously like the day of the year you were born on, right? That doesn't really say that much about you, right? It's a very simplistic way to look at astrology. But regardless, like I did have this book. I would flip through it. I would take it to sleepovers with my friends and like turn to their birthday page and read it to them. And actually, my copy is so fucked. Like the cover is not on it. It's literally just like the unspined, like naked book now. It's super super funny. But yeah, so that's my childhood. That's your little Freudian look into like the indications I would become an occultist because they were definitely there. Um, Now, some of this could have led me down the path of being like an asshole atheist for sure, but I think it's that I always believed in the universe and God that kind of kept me from that. Now, when I actually got interested in occultism, it was after a specific event in my life. And I don't really want to go into insane depth about what this event was. I'll try to simplify it as much as possible, but I do need to still give some information on it. So you guys actually understand like the situation. Because the thing is with me is I didn't like just wake up one day and decide to become like a witch. Like that's not really how that went. It's not like I saw a TikTok video and went, okay, yeah, like witchcraft is the thing I'm going to do, right? It was actually after a pretty terrible event happened in my life where I started to think about things. So let's get into the story. So basically, I was 15 years old and I was kind of having one of the worst years of my life. I've had worse times than this since then, I will admit. Like, 2024 especially has been like, it was kicking my ass really hard for the first half of the year. But basically at 15, I was going through it. I mean, who isn't going through it at 15? And there was some like problems with my family going on. Like there was quite a bit of family dysfunction, and I was actually developing some health problems. So that all sort of combined. And of course, like when your physical health is not great, your mental health is not great. And this just started getting worse and worse and worse. And I started getting very scared. And this actually accumulated with me having a near death experience at age 15, which is a great way to fuck with your head really hard. But basically, I had a near death experience. And what was really crazy is when I was actually like dying, essentially, though, of course, I didn't literally die. Like, I didn't even, like, my heart didn't even stop. But it was, I think, in the realm of the near death experience because basically, as I was approaching that experience, this like primal fear overtook me, right? And I was like, I have to do anything to survive. Like I just started saying anything that is out there. Like I did that prayer style again. I was like, anything that's out there, please do whatever it is to save me. I'll repay you however I want. I'll do anything. I don't want to die right now. I'm not ready to die. Like that was just all my thoughts. And then my thoughts all stopped. And this is when I believed I was dying. I started seeing these colors, and I still don't understand what these colors were. I don't know. And hearing this like weird pitched noise that it sounded like a ringing type sound. I don't know. It was very weird. But when this sort of ended and came to, and I went to the doctors, right? Because obviously, like emergency room time. I just was like sitting there, and I was like, what happened? What was that? And to this day, I'm not entirely sure what it is that I experienced. I still don't have all the answers to that. But when I got to the ER, I really started thinking, holy shit, I almost died. And I was on the way to the ER. I remember looking out like the window and being shocked by how everything was normal. Like, of course, the world doesn't revolve around me. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying like the world should have been freaking out over me. Like, that's not what I'm saying with that. But like, basically, everything was normal, right? Everything kept moving, everything kept turning. And it got me thinking about there is someone at any moment, including while you're listening to this podcast, who is having like the worst day of their life, their worst experience of this life. And no matter what, the world keeps turning, right? It keeps going. And that thought, it humbles you, it makes you feel small, and it makes you think about the universe. Like, I feel like it's very much the Wheel of Fortune tarot card when you have moments like that, when you're like, oh, wow, despite everything, everything goes on. Everyone has their own life, right? It's one of those basic existential thoughts that people have. But even though it is basic, it is one that gets you going. And then when I was in the ER, right? And I was actually like sitting in the bed, and I looked around a lot. Like I just was watching people. I was people watching. And I was like, kind of just having a full-blown existential crisis at this point. I was like, what does it all mean? Is this my future, right? Is my future one of suffering and misery and sickness? Because the truth is, if things didn't change where I was at that point, that would have been my future. That would have been my life. Like my life was not going in a good direction. Things were not going well. Like things just didn't look good. And I was like, well, something needs to change. What needs to change? What do I need to do to make some sort of difference in my life? And the first thing I did was I turned to self-help books, right? It's a whole genre of stuff. And the thing is, I started reading the self-help books, and honestly, like most self-help is exactly the same, right? Like it's the same old stuff, same old bullshit. But what is interesting is if you read enough self-help, you notice things like mindset, mindfulness, right? That all seeps into it. And it actually got me thinking about religion again, because in regards of religion, I never had an answer. I knew firmly, like I truly believed that there was something out there. There was a God. There was a thing that exists, but I didn't know what it was, and I didn't understand it, and I wanted to understand it. I was like, okay, maybe if I have the answer to that question, then I can fix my life and things can go on a better track, right? And so I started seriously thinking about religion, and the self-help books, as well as that moment when I was praying to whatever, right? Those two things, I kept thinking about that moment, right? I was reading the self-help books that kind of vaguely reference religion, and then I was ruminating on the moment when I prayed to what is out there, right? And I was like, so what is out there? Like I started asking it as a question and not as like a directive of prayer. And then I started seriously considering religion. And I knew that I wasn't a Christian. I knew that there were things in Christianity that just didn't sit right with me and didn't make sense to me. And so I was like, okay, what else is out there? And I started just researching like everything I can get my hands on. I am a kind of obsessive person. And so if there's a topic I'm interested in, it becomes my life. Like I get fixated. It becomes like my interest. Like I always have like a interest. And for me, like esotericism and occultism is like my interest. Like it's something that no matter how much I read about it, I will still want to know more. I could talk about it for 18,000 hours. Like it is my interest for sure. And basically like religion became my interest, right? It became my like fixation that I was really devoting a lot of time to. And I wanted to answer these questions, and I got filled with this like thirst for knowledge, this desire for knowledge. And it felt like every time I read something, I was getting closer and closer to the answer. So I started diving just deep into everything. And what did appeal to me is I actually, there were two books that kind of threw me towards occultism, and I will credit for that. There was this green book about paganism. I don't know what it's called. I got it at a library. It's this like giant green book. No clue the name. It wasn't a particularly good book. Like I'm not gonna waste my time trying to find what book this was. Just know it was green and big. Because it was like mid, but it told me about paganism, right? It told me about these things. And I was like, this sounds kind of interesting. Like the regional traditions things are interesting to me. Because I knew that like being from Appalachia, like there's a lot of like superstitions and like there's a lot of stuff like that. Like the thing is like when you live in the Appalachian Mountains, like a lot of people who have had creepy spiritual experiences, like people talk about it quite a bit here. Because there definitely is like a spiritual presence to the mountains. And so I was like, okay, well, the idea of like earth and land having a spiritual component makes sense to them because I had grown up hearing people talking about creepy experiences, right? So I was like, okay, that could make some sense. And then, I started kind of exploring the idea of like earth based spirituality. And, when I explain this, I often say I was doing like Appalachian folk magic. Now, I don't think that's an accurate term. I was just kind of trying to figure out what the traditions of my area are and like starting there. Now, you could say that term. I don't really think that's what I was doing. I was kind of doing like some sort of weird blend of like folk traditions and like some like Wicca type stuff. Like it was just kind of like vague witchcrafty stuff. But the thing is, it didn't become my path permanently because what I didn't like about that is it didn't give me like an explanation for why anything works. And I'm someone who is kind of a logical person. Like I like to know why I'm doing something and not just do something without a reason. Like I'm like, what is the reason? What is the point of this? What am I, you know what I'm saying? Like I wanted an answer to that. And I knew that this type of stuff wasn't really going to give me that answer. Now, if I would have looked deep enough into Wicca or something, like that does give you an answer. But where I was looking, like I was looking at beginner stuff, like it just was not answering that. It was like, okay, this is how you do a spell. And I was like, well, why does it work? Like, what's the point of this? And so I just wasn't content with it. And so I wanted an actual answer as to why I am doing things like that. That was just bothering me. And I was actually, I will mention, I was seeing some success. Like I tried some of these folk traditions. Like I did this thing where you would like tie ribbon together 9 times and like tie fate together and things would happen. And I was actually seeing results. Like I was seeing synchronicities. I was seeing actual progress, like stuff was happening. So I was like, okay, this seems somewhat legit. Like I began believing that like magic probably exists. Like I wasn't convinced 100% yet, but I was like, there seems to be something to this. Like I thought I was following the right trail, even if I wasn't at like the end of the trail. Now, things got wild when I got a copy of the book. I bought this at Barnes & Noble, The Black Arts by Richard Cavendish. Now, I would like to say this is not that great of a book, okay? It's not that great. Like, it is unnecessarily edgy. It doesn't really give you any practical instructions. Basically, what this book is it's like a chapter devoted to each like major idea of occultism. But this was my first exposure to actual occultism that was not like witchcraft type stuff because I love paganism. I do consider myself a pagan, but I don't do like Wicca type, druid type stuff. Like those druidry and Wicca are not really my path. So that was not what actually like deeply resonated with me. But once I started reading Black Arts by Richard Cavendish, things started resonating with me a lot more because since that book is like a survey of like what is Hermeticism, what's a bit of the history of it, what's a bit of like its meaning, like that really appealed to me because it gave somewhat of a why. I was like, okay, this actually explains things to me beyond like this is how you make a sigil, right? So I really liked this book. I still have my copy. It's very precious to me. It's a big like nostalgia piece for me. Would I recommend this book as like a beginner book? I mean, not really. I think there's just some edge in it that doesn't need to be there. And there are better books, but it's so special to me that I gotta save it a soft space in my heart because this is what actually introduced me to real occultism. Now, after this book, I learned these terms and I was able to actually on the internet find things that relate to what I want to do. I discovered the 7 Hermetic principles, which are the ideas from the Kabbalion. And, now I know they're not real Hermeticism. But at the time, I read the 7 Hermetic principles, which, to be fair, are pretty much true. Like the 7 Hermetic principles are like pretty much right. They're just not really Hermeticism. So, at the time I was like, really buying into the 7 Hermetic principles was very good for me at this point in my path. And so 7 Hermetic principles, gospel. They're now my like law. And Black Arts by Cavendish, #1 book. Love that book. And so those two things together, right? I began my path into actual ceremonial magic with these two things together, right? We all have such fun, like silly things we read earlier on. I know a lot of people have ones that are even wilder. So, but that was my like beginner beliefs once I started getting towards the path that I would eventually go down. Now, as it got deeper into ceremonial magic, I started trying doing LBRPs, and quickly I came across Aleister Crowley's work, because you can't be doing ceremonial magic for that long, especially when you're a hyper-fixated researcher who wants to Google everything all the time, right? And not come across Crowley. So I come across Crowley, and the first thing I read by Crowley was the Book of the Law. And I do not recommend the Book of the Law as a first read, because I read it and I thought it was wacko. I was like, this makes no sense. This is like schizophrenic rambling. And then I got to the end and it's like, destroy this book after reading it. And I'm like, why would I do that? Also, this is on my computer, so not destroying my computer. So I just like closed out the tab and was like, okay, cool. So, then I stepped away from Crowley for a bit and kind of stayed with that like vague ceremonial magic stuff I was doing. And then I actually started reading about what Crowley discusses. Like I read commentary on Crowley instead of Crowley himself. Like people who are writing like, this is what Thelema is, this is what will is. And that actually was like a better intro for me, because then I started actually understanding the ideas. Now, I would say if you're going to read Crowley, you should start with some of his writings about what he believes, like Magic Without Tears, Magic in Theory and Practice. Those are actually good places to start. Now, I do think reading those commentaries, which is really helpful for me so that I knew what I was actually getting into, are good. I know that Lon Milo Duquette has some great commentary, and so do the David Shoemaker, Living Thelema people. Like, they all have good commentary type stuff. So, I mean, for me, the commentaries type stuff was super valuable because it gave me the information to know, like, first of all, what I should be reading of Crowley, because if you don't, you're going to read his stuff that maybe is not like beginner material. But it also gave me that information that I needed to read that deeper stuff. And that was really valuable for me. And once I started reading the commentaries on Crowley and reading like actual Crowley material that you should read early on and not the Book of the Law, I really resonated with the idea of true will. That really connected with me because I believe in the power of willpower. I've always vaguely believed in spirituality, and it was a tangible way to make change. And the idea that like will, like magic is will making change, explained why all these spells I was doing were working. Like it gave me an actual why. It gave me a theory on why magic exists. And I found the idea of like that your will alone, like through sheer force of will, you can completely change your life and create a new life and make anything happen. Like that was a very inspiring thought to me. Like that was one that I found beautiful because at the time, like I was just not in a good situation and I needed things to change. And, we don't have as much control over our external situation, but we do have control of ourselves and our mind. And so I was like, I understand that. I understand I can't control things that are outside of me. So what if I actually use my mind and what I can control in order to affect those things outwardly? That would be how magic works. And so basically I started adoring Thelema and I got really into it. I worked on finding my true will. I learned Thelemic rituals and I started like slowly but surely gravitating towards becoming a full-on Thelemite. Now, I was always this whole time practicing things outside of the Thelema sphere in my practice. Like I was never at any point only doing like Crowley rituals. That was never a phase I went through. I saw Thelema as like a system and less so like Crowleyolatry. And I never really idolized Crowley in the way some Thelemites do. But I did definitely look up on him. Like I was like, wow, he's such a great figure. Now, as I start actually implementing these things and I start going further and further with this, like my life actually did improve. My quality of life went way up. My sickness went away and my mental health got a lot better. And so while there was still some problems, especially with like family dysfunction, like that didn't really go away. My personal life was a lot better and my mindset was a lot better. So my life quality went a lot up. And I avoided that really scary fate of my life not changing. So through the power of magic and ceremonial magic early on, I really did change my life like for the best and come a long way. Now, once I started like getting a long way, I started experimenting a bit more. Like early on, I was really like following the basics. Like I was sticking to, simple things. And then I get my confidence magicitis phase, which I think like it's kind of like new relationship energy, but for religion. They call it convert fervor in mainstream religions. And I think that's a good term. I think we should use this term because people definitely get it with occultism just in the magicitis form, where I got really confident And I was like, okay, I understand how rituals work. I'm like the master of magic, right? They call this the Dunning-Kruger effect too, where like when you have a little bit of information, you think you understand everything completely, and then you have a moment where you realize you don't know everything, and you kind of fall down this peak and then begin like the process of real learning. And for me, I hit that peak and I was making a lot of progress connecting with deities. I actually, in this time before my Dunning-Kruger moment, actually connected with the god that would be my patron, who I credit with so much of my growth and I see as like my god, like the god that I venerate the highest. So made a lot of great progress in this time. I'm not knocking anything I did in this time, but I did get a little overly confident. And I think the way to prevent becoming overly confident, Nuon, is doing shadow work from the beginning. You see, I had not started with shadow work. Shadow work was not a huge buzzword at this time. And so I wasn't doing that. And as well, the idea of like contemplation was not brought up a lot. The reason why I stress when I teach people magic that you should have both you should have like a three-legged practice, right? Like a little tripod of a practice. You should have your actual like praxis, like the actual doing of the magic. You should have study time and you should have contemplation time. And the reason why I recommend this is contemplation time keeps you grounded and keeps you from getting megasitis. But I didn't have contemplation explained to me. I didn't have shadow work explained to me. And of course, I was a solitary practitioner, just to be clear. I did not live in a major city. There were not like local occult resources for me. So I was really on my own and just kind of figuring it out by myself. I knew one other practitioner. I knew this girl who was like raised Wiccan, but she herself hadn't done a lot of research, right? She just kind of grew up in her family's like coven they were exposed to. So that's really all like in terms of other practitioners I knew. And of course I was like on the internet, like reading people's experiences on the internet, but that's not the same of like having a mentor or having someone personal you can talk to, right? Like I was really just figuring it out. And the girl I knew who was actually like raised Wiccan had a lot of very strong opinions on what type of magic people should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. She was very Wiccan raid, law of three, right? Like you kind of had to do it her way or bad. Like when I talked to her about Thelema, she was really opposed to this. She had a problem with Thelema, which is weird because I don't think I've ever met another Wiccan who had a problem with Thelema. Like most Wiccans seem to be really, really cool with Thelema. I don't know what was with this girl, but she had a problem with it. And anyways, I'm doing a lot by myself. I'm not really communicating with other people about my practice. I didn't have that community infrastructure. And I didn't have time contemplating. I didn't have shadow work. No one told me to do that. So basically I had this experience where there was this like, I don't know how to explain this easily. So basically there was a figure, a shadow entity, a ghost. I don't know exactly what to describe this thing as. That right on Walpurgisnacht, I remember the date, it was Walpurgisnacht, appeared in this girl's room who me and the girl who was raised Wiccan were friends with, and we got texted to help her deal with it because, of course, I'm like the cocky occultist who thinks I know everything, and she was raised Wiccan, and so we were like amateur Ghostbusters or something, and we show up to her room, and this spirit, man, this was not a ghost. This thing, we saw it. Like, and this happened, or we all had like group schizophrenia, like folia du style. Folia du? Is that how you pronounce that? I don't know. And so the three of us, me, my Wiccan friend, and the girl, like all like stare at it, and I go to LBRP it away, right? And this spirit, man, my LBRP wasn't gonna do shit. Like it actually, the spirit looked me into the eyes, and I got this piercing third eye headache. Like that was a spiritual attack. That spirit was out to get me. It was like, hell no, this girl has been an occultist for 4 months. Man, she is not gonna take me out. And yeah, I got this horrible headache and I felt really sick, and I walked out of the room. I had my athame with me because I was going to do the LBRP holding an athame that I had blessed. And by the way, my athame was not a real athame. My athame was a pair of hair cutting shears that I was cutting my bangs with. That was made out of silver that I had consecrated as my athame. Real DIY budget, like teenager getting into occultism moment there. And the spirit attacks me, and I walk out the room, and I'm like, oh God, I don't know what to do. And the Wiccan girl attempts nothing, like just nothing comes of that. And so we just take that third girl and we just like hide out together. We just had like an impromptu sleepover, and we're like, okay, well, we're staying away from that. And then we go back the next day and it was gone. But it was this really intense experience. And after that, I got humbled. I was like, okay, so entities actually are stronger than us. And this is the moment when I realized things like the psychological paradigm have to be wrong, because when you're new to like ceremonial type magic, you're really exposed to the psychological paradigm, or the idea that it's all your mind, like the entities are not external, they're just like constructs of your psychology. After that, no, like we all three of us saw the exact same entity, the same shadow figure. I can visualize it in my head. It was like this gray, black toned, like horned entity with glowing eyes. It was very freaky. And I still don't 100% know what the spirit was. I think it was some sort of like land spirit or ghost or local spirit. I don't know. I don't think this was a god or like some really high up spirit. I mean, maybe it was a demon at most. But yeah, it was freaky. It was enough to overpower like a baby occultist who has no clue what she's doing, right? And anyways, after this, I realized, okay, spirits are more powerful than us. Spirits are external, and I'm not an expert yet, right? There's a lot more learning I have to do before I can consider myself like a learned occultist or anything like that. Like, I am actually very early on. I might be able to do some more complicated rituals. Like, at this point, I was already like invoking and evoking spirits. Like, I was doing like true ceremonial magic at this point, but I was not at the level that I thought it was. And it was good because it gave me perspective. And it also solidified my beliefs in my head of, okay, this is real. I believe in occultism. I believe in like paganism. Like it gave me a lot of answers and clarity on my path, and gave me some perspective. So after this point, I learned more at a reasonable place and started looking at like, okay, well, how do real occult orders like train their occultist? What is the actual pace for that? And I started taking my studies a lot more seriously. And with time started moving towards a slightly more like advanced practice. Also at this time, I did discover working with the planet, like after this experience, this was probably like 5 months after that experience, I started really discovering the idea of like working with the planets. And that really was interesting to me because I always found astrology interesting. And so I began working with the planets. That was not my majority practice yet, but it did get heavily incorporated into what I would call like a Thelema majority practice. And I actually started calling myself like a Thelemite. Like that became my identification. Like when people would ask me my religion, I would say I am a Thelemite. And I actually stayed with Thelema for a very, very long time. The only time like when I have questioned that I was a Thelemite was like a year or two ago. Because as time has gone on, like I spent, and I will be doing a story time about all my time in Thelema and my Thelema experiences. Like that's going to be a whole podcast too. But I have in the past like year really pivoted towards perennialism and paganism and planetary magic. I still believe Thelemic philosophy. I still do Thelemic rituals a lot, but Thelema is no longer like more than 50% of my practice. And so I don't lead with that as my like practitioner identification, because there are other things that are more dominant in my practice now, like planetary magic and perennialism and paganism are a lot more dominant. But yeah, Thelema became like a huge part of my life for a very, very long time. And I still actually use a lot of Thelemic rituals. And I actually, when I was mostly Thelema, like I experimented with groups. I've had a lot of Thelema experiences. So that'll be a whole story in and of itself. I would say that's the story of the first chapter of my occult experiences. Like that's where it began. That's how I went from like a child who was a precocious kid who was obnoxious in church to identifying as a Thelemite, because Thelema is the next big chapter of my spiritual experiences. So that's my first chapter. And I'll be real, I was an inexperienced practitioner. I didn't know what I was doing, and I made a lot of mistakes. And I think it's good for me to talk about this. I have a big gripe with occult influencers and bloggers who don't admit that they made mistakes and don't admit that they were ever new. Like, I made a lot of mistakes. I made a ton of mistakes, and I think it's good for me to talk about it. So I talked about some of my mistakes. I got megasitis, I got cocky, I got convert fervor, and I spent some time kind of exploring like dead-end practices that were not for me before I found a practice that I actually stuck with for a while. And I read some books that were not that good books, right? Like I had a lot of those beginner experiences that I think everyone has that people are too embarrassed to talk about. And like many people, I came into this from a bad place. And I'm eternally grateful for occultism for bringing me out of that place, because even though I've actually had, in terms of like negative external events that have happened in my life, I've actually had worse stuff happen than that. Like, as crazy as that sounds, like I've had some really bad shit happen in my life. But what I've noticed is even when those really bad things happen to me or people I love, I deal with them better, and I have a lot better perspective, and they get ended quicker, right? Like I spend less time in the pit whenever anything bad happens than I did before occultism. And so I have so much gratitude for the gods. The gods have given me like a better life on every level. And so I'm so grateful for this path. I'm so grateful for occultism. It has been an amazing force in my life. And I'm not going to lie and say like I did one ritual and then like my life was perfect. Like that's not true. But it did give me the tools to improve my life and have a better life than I had before. And for that, I will always be grateful for the occult and glad that it was part of my life. The reason why I actually started making podcasts about it is because I want other people to be able to improve their lives in the way I did, because I'm so grateful for what occultism did for me in that period of my life that I kind of want everyone to have the chance to have that same experience, because I don't want anyone else to suffer in the way that I suffered, right? And I mean, in life we do suffer, like there's no avoiding that, but I think people can suffer a little bit less by finding spiritual traditions that work for them. So that's all I have to say in this podcast. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please review the podcast and like the podcast. And I will see you guys in the next podcast. You can support this podcast on Patreon. On Patreon, you get a bonus episode every Sabbath. The next one should be Samhain or Halloween. So that's really hype. You also get all the episodes early and get a bonus pre-show episode with every podcast. So that's like a little extra, like 10 minutes, 5 minutes of me talking about another subject. Sometimes the pre-show is really serious, and sometimes the pre-show is just kind of like fun. So you should definitely check out the pre-show. The pre-show is super cool. And you can find me under Dot Darling on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Telegram, Substack. I do some freelance journalism too, so that's really cool. But it's all under Dot Darling or Georgina Rose. I've been your host, Georgina Rose, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, morning, mid-morning, evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye!